Welcome to the Work Matters podcast. In each episode, talking with thought leaders and executives, Purpose Works founder Thomas Bertels explores what it takes to make work more productive, valuable, impactful, and meaningful. Let's begin the conversation.
So welcome to the Work Matters podcast. Our guest today is Sergio Caredda. And Sergio is based in Venice, Italy. You're an HR leader. You're also the author of an excellent newsletter called The Intentional Organization. So with all of that, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Thomas, for the invitation. Very happy to join you.
Your newsletter is called The Intentional Organization. A curious choice of words. Explain maybe to our listeners what you mean by an intentional organization.
The concept of intentional organization came to me out of my HR experience. Working in different roles in HR, I noticed that there are a lot of organizations that are doing great or doing well in certain areas, but very often their design is not consistent in all of its components. And so it came about with the concept of intentional organization, because we think of an organization that has a strong purpose, not necessarily a good one, that's a different topic, but a strong purpose that identifies both a moral direction externally and an ethical direction internally. And through this, leadership is able to create consistency in the different components of the organization itself. The idea is the following. A lot of leaders are normally trying to fix small details within the organization, whereas here it's about more keeping the broader picture and keeping aligned the different components in order to define the outcome of the organization itself and its performance. And you notice it that very often organizations that are really successful really display a very high level of this consistency, which from my point of view, it's always tied into intentional actions by managers and leaders within that organization.
So I can see like a strong linkage, obviously, to topics like purpose and values, right, and cultural dimensions. But you're also writing a lot about organization design. There's so many questions related to organization design. Who does it, right? Is it right HR's role, or is it the line manager's role, and how do you go about it? And oftentimes I feel like most leaders get stuck at the moving the boxes on the org chart from left to right or up and down.
For me, again, out of experience, org design is one of the most important disciplines that we need to develop within organization, especially in the HR job family, but not only limited to the HR job family. And the reason is that actually leadership and management in organization do organization design constantly, but very often they're not equipped with the tools to actually assess what the outcomes of their actions are. And here the entire concept of intentionality comes into. I give you an example. Very often a company might do its own strategic design, whether through strategic planning or any other type of methodology. But very often you don't have then a way to translate that into an operating model decision or into an org design, unless you start thinking about processes like budgeting or elements like these, but those are not really fit for purpose. So one of the problems that you have sometimes is, okay, I have my strategy of opening 5 new markets, but where does the talent need sit? Just to give an example. Or what are the policies that I need to develop? What are the systems that I need to have? And all of this very often gets kind of jeopardized in a way that at the end you need to rush into a lot of small projects to then get the capabilities to then reach your strategy. The idea is that org design instead provides the tools to match this. And as you pointed out also effectively, org design is not about putting boxes on an org chart. That's the last step of the process. And it's about looking at the consistency of a lot of the elements, which for me, especially today, org design has a very big challenge in making the concept itself of work appealing for people that are outside the organization, because we need also to capture this changing meaning of work that is happening. And org design is exactly one of the key pillars of the work of org design, is translating work into jobs, okay, or maybe into the new ways of working we're constantly discussing, but many people don't yet get understanding of what this actually means within an organization.
I'm 100% there with you in terms of the need to really, connect strategy to org design to job design, right? I find that oftentimes when it comes to the job design, the strategy oftentimes seems to be copy paste, right? We're copying a job description that we get from somewhere, and we're replicating that. Do you see leaders getting a little bit more sophisticated when it comes to job design, or HR for that matter? Do you see people actually becoming more intentional about crafting jobs that enable high performance?
In some cases, yes. The problem is, and this affects job design, but it affects all other aspects of org design, is the fact that we have all fallen victim of the concept of best practice. We all think that we can just rush in what Henry Mintzberg once defined the organization bazaar. It's almost like there is a store, I have a need, I pick something and I put it in my organization. This is the piece that is more dangerous. And it's dangerous, especially today. What I mean is, in the 70s, probably it worked. There was a lot more stability on the market, a lot more organizations were similar in the way. And so we started applying elements like job profiling, competency models, job descriptions. We copied things from one side to the other. Today, all of this is not working anymore, and it's not working as intended. Even if on one side, the acceleration that we're seeing from many different aspects of the external context push managers and leaders still to seek for ready-to-use solutions, but they very, very seldom exist. So if you think about just what happened during the pandemic with this big remote work experiment we all went through, we all understood that this was not about technology, because basically every company within 1 or 2 weeks was able to have their people working remote. It was more of a concept of how organizations were ready and how even the concept of work was intended within the companies. I'm conducting a small experiment with a number of mentees actually in Italy, about 100 people that kind of subscribed to a small program that I'm doing for them internally. And one of the concepts that I'm trying to tell them is that there is a very important transition that we need to think between work design, okay, which is how we design really all of the activities and what needs to be done within an organization, the job design, which is how we shape that into roles, and job crafting, which is the piece that then the person, the individual, adds to that role. And I think we have been concentrated too much on the intermediate pillar, on the idea of having these very long, detailed job descriptions that by the moment you finish writing them, they're already old, okay? And instead, we need to focus a lot more attention on the first part, because very often we don't have a lot of ideas about how work needs to be designed in an organization and how to measure, for example, productivity and performance on that. And on the opposite side, we need to give room, okay, to the job crafting element. Also, these is where intentionality plays also a key role, in the sense that we need to enable an organization to make this happen. Again, coming to the example of remote work, yes or not, we all know that the center issue here is autonomy. And autonomy is not something that you can dictate. It's not something that, well, from tomorrow you're going to be autonomous and that's happening. It's something that you need to create a soil that gets fertile for then the people to get autonomous, for the people to get self-organized, for the people to act in terms of self-management, etc. And this is where some leaders are capturing this now. And here probably the difference between those organizations that are capturing the remote work wave, not as a benefit that I'm offering to some people, because this is a stream that is happening at the moment, but as really an element to see a new meaning of work that is also appearing outside for many of the people. And I think this is where intentionality in terms of how I build then the organization, also as you mentioned before, in terms of the values, the leadership, the core components also of how I define collaboration and elements and autonomy, for example, within an organization, are really important today.
What obviously strikes me is that becomes a fairly comprehensive effort. Got to start all the way from what are we here as an organization to the values, the culture, and cascade that all the way down. And it strikes me as that oftentimes then requires the people at the very top of the organization to buy into this. It's kind of difficult to reshape culture at the bottom of the organization. Right? So that requires a fairly enlightened set of leaders? Do they exist out there? What's holding them back?
It's true that in many ways the true innovation has been coming from within organization where there was a very strong leadership. But what I've been observing is that very often there are a lot of realms of possibilities also for middle manager to express and to influence results within organization also from this point of view. What I notice is, for example, that in many organizations, there have always been pockets of jobs that were done remotely. There have always been teams that have been agile in the way they work. There have always been projects that has been running across silos, even if the organization was really siloed. So what you point here is a question, are we focused on really getting a strong decision that the entire organization needs to work in a way, okay, and then you really need to have senior leadership focusing on that? Or can we also look at some middle managers, some mid-level leader that are anyway taking their chance to improve working condition, I call them with a very broad sense. And I think we need to look at this because you probably need both. And one should not be the justification for the other. Many managers are telling very often, no, I cannot do the first step because the leadership is not allowing me to do that, or vice versa. A lot of leaders are complaining that they are not able to really change the way work is acting because their middle management is not coping. There is truth in both versions. What we need to do is very often is to start and do small steps. Throughout my career, and I've been in many, especially at the beginning in initial positions, I've seen that I've always been able also to do the difference in the way my team was working, etc., etc. Sometimes through small actions. All the people that have worked with me can testify that I gave them a lot of autonomy, and they learned along the way what autonomy means. And that was something that I've always been able to do within the guidelines of organization that were existing. But sometimes I consider myself a little bit of a rebel in certain organization on trying to fight those elements that we can sometimes call organizational debt, which are those choices that an organization has done that are going against the results and the performance you want to achieve. Sometimes are policies, sometimes are organizational choices, etc. I think that sometimes it's too easy to say it's all the fault of the leader in the sense of them not giving the direction. We need both from this point of view. For sure, strong changes really, let's say, revolutionary changes need a leadership perspective on that, because we still live in a context where a hierarchical top-down approach is a reality. So there are many people that in order to get moved need to get somehow a view or a push from the top.
I think you're right. I mean, there are opportunities for leadership to be exercised at all levels, right? And you're probably also correct that probably most middle managers underestimate the degrees of freedom that they have. Now, they might not have a language or framework to actually do that work, to think it through, but they probably have more possibilities than they have. On the flip side, though, I think there's some very structural issues like management processes, budgeting, performance reviews that I guess also get in the way, right, for leaders to exercise that autonomy. Any thoughts on that? What needs to happen in that space?
I just mentioned one concept, which is this concept of organizational debt, which many organizations go through and don't consider very well. But and it's coming again to having this holistic view. I've been personally, for example, running through an experience in one of the organizations where I've been through a large digital transformation process in which we got the digital organization to start implementing agile methodology in software delivery. And we really try to tune the organization to get an entire agile organization for its consumer-facing digital products. But then all of a sudden we got into a problem because the budgeting process was a standard yearly budget process. So those things don't really work together. And that is one of the area where when you start speaking with people, they understand it, that, well, you would need something more flexible. Yes, but the budgeting process stays. And this is one of the areas, it's a little bit like the hierarchy that nobody wants to put in discussion, even if there are so many proofs that these processes very often are harmful to the organization. Are harmful in the way they are done. And very often it's because we have copied a process for somewhere. In many ways, I think that one of the largest damages that very often has been done to organization has been the large ERP implementation, because it's almost like we got this blueprint from one organization to another. They were probably born in non-industrial German context, and now we have applied them to all type of organizations outside that. And for me, that element creates, again, one area of big organizational debt that we are not putting into question. There is a problem, we put a policy, and then policies pile up and create a stiffened organization. And impact, I would say, more morale, the impact, the responsibilization of individuals into achieving results within the companies. So this is also a conundrum that we need to really focus on really how are we able to create agility, not just as a concept for software development, but agility is about simplifying, and simplicity very often it's about fighting the negative aspect of bureaucracy that are within organization. One of the points that I wanted to make is also when reflecting on the concept of intentional organization, I really focus on this fact about coherence and consistency, because intentional organization does not mean that there is an absolute best organization model. Also, traditional command and control hierarchy will work very well depending on the context. If I have a nuclear plant and I want to ensure safety, probably a command and control hierarchy organization will be the best possible solution there. And probably a competency-based approach still will focus on very much and with risk control, etc., how you want it. If I need to develop software, if I need to organize a restaurant, or if I need to experiment innovation, well, maybe I need something different. And this is the element that we need to really consider a lot in how we develop organization and how especially we also think in terms of how they perform.
Talking about organizations and agility, I mean, one of the dimensions there is size and complexity. I'd be interested in your perspective. I think there are various answers, right? Effective team size is 7. Some of the field work, I think, suggests that's like an effective org size is maybe 200 employees or something along those lines, right? So which would suggest that if you get like a lot larger than that, right, then oftentimes you get diseconomies of scale. Any thoughts on effective organization size and how to overcome the diseconomies of scale?
There are many theories around that, but this is really where the importance of org design comes into place. Because at the beginning, if you just think about how organizations form, okay, in society, not just around companies, it's about when groups of people start pulling together. And up until a certain amount of people, we always refer to the Dunbar number. It can be 120, 130. There are various theories around that, but there is a level after which you need structure to overcome the limits of the fruition of interaction among the people. So for me, there is not one unique answer around this, because it is about balancing the need and the consistency of what you want to achieve. If you think about some of the largest organizations on earth, and also some of the largest organizations that have been surviving millennia, think about the Catholic Church or something like that, they're pretty big. So saying that we cannot have organization above a certain number, it's probably misleading. What we need to always look at is the consistency we create and how they actually work and how we balance, because at the end, we always look at the fact that organization design, it's a careful alchemy between centralization and decentralization. And I use the word alchemy exactly because there is not a scientific recipe around this. Sometimes there is also a little bit of luck, sometimes there is a little bit of the general condition around, but it's about this element that we need to look at. Look, I've got a lot of experience with retail. Retail is an interesting word because you have organizations that are normally fairly centralized, but also act with a distributed network of stores. Sometimes these stores are pretty small in terms of footprint of people. So ideally, they have the ideal team size, 8, 10, 15 people, 20 people, something like that. And I've done a very interesting project one, really assessing and comparing stores. A very interesting feature of retail is that you can compare stores, especially if you have a lot of those. We try to look at what is that really makes a good store. And at the end, it's the narrative we know. It's a good leader, and it is a good team that works within a framework that you put in place. As well as one of the things that we noticed was a leader that was able to bend the rules. This is the narrative that we need to understand. So somebody that is acting within the rules does not infringe them completely, but is able sometimes to bend them. Okay, all of the countries, especially in Europe, have some very strict rules about part-time. But at the end, the stores that really work are those where the team comes in when it's needed, even if sometimes this means bending the rules of the labor law in the country. Now, this is the aspect that we need to consider, and this is how organization work in reality. And this is what makes organization work beside the real size. What I think is that we, especially as HR professionals, need to translate this reality into organizational setup, considering certain aspects that one of the elements that everybody speaks is about the span of control, and it's not about that a manager cannot control 20 people, because if you just think it from a control point of view, you could, but then they would not be able to work as a team. And one of the complexity that we see today, for example, with so many leaders, I'm thinking of chief executive officer with this huge propagation of CXO roles, ending up having too many reporting lines. This means that they have a less effective team. Because at the end, it's about human dynamics at that point. It's about the interpersonal skill in the team. You can have put all of the structure around it, but it's about how good and how well those teams will be able to perform. The idea here is we need to find the perfect alchemy of balancing. Size is one component. And because, for example, size for me also has an absolutely different meaning today if you think about half of the people or maybe more working remotely versus having all of the people in the room. There is another element which I think it's important to consider, and it is what is that we want to achieve. Is it productivity? Is it performance? Is it effectiveness? Is it efficiency? And I think here it's another characteristic of what I think the intentional organization means for me, which is clearly and really intentionally focusing on defining what value means for your organization. And that's why you define your purpose. How you want to translate this to your customer, and this is the business model you implement, and you need to have this linked. A lot of organizations don't have those two links, and that's why they don't work. And then what is your operating model, which is the value chain that then translates inputs and outputs within the organization in practice. This is the place where I think we have more troubles in organization and defining. It's not about the number of people in the team that make the effectiveness, but it's about the fact that too many managers and leaders don't pose their question about what is really valuable within our team, what is really valuable in our organization. And for me, this is critical. We always take for granted that we want to have just money, profit, etc. And instead, it's a lot more variegated than this, and we need to consider this.
Following your line of thought, right, there's obviously a huge opportunity for the HR function to play a role in right, crafting a more intentional organization. But I probably imagine that there's also a lot of HR organizations that are not at all prepared to take on any kind of leadership role in this. It strikes me as, at least what I see in the US context, a lot of times the HR function is more administratively oriented, enforcing the labor rules and so forth, right? Versus, let's say, being effective architects and designers. Maybe 10, 20 years ago, larger organizations had sort of the luxury of having some people that thought about this. But in my experience, a lot of those capabilities have been dismantled over the last 10, 15, 20 years. Would you agree? I mean, do you see any like more progressive HR organizations that have invested in creating those capabilities?
Partially, yes. And I think that some organizations, some companies have invested in an HR that has been able to develop competences into this field. Some organizations instead got stuck a little bit into an older idea, and it's not just the administrative focus that very often got there, but it's also a little bit of a misleading idea of what HR business partnering means, okay, to my mind. Sometimes I see that a lot more dangerous, where some of my colleagues, I'm also part of this professional family, they end up trying to substitute themselves into some business decision instead of really being there to support. Okay, and this is a key element. I still think that a lot of the Ulrich model is valid today in terms of the idea that HR is a support function that need to provide capabilities building for the organization. Okay. However, this was sometimes misinterpreted in the sense that, well, we turned ourselves into a shared service providing just a support, like help desk support. No, that's not just that. Because what we need to think about is, and today some of the concepts that are helping into this are, for example, concepts around the employee journey, okay, so that we really can understand what our customer needs and we can focus on that. But we need to think it's not just the employees on their own, so not just individual, but it's also the organization. So we need to think also, we need almost to create a parallel concept of the organizational journey. I give you one example. I have always tried to teach my team that one of the critical moments for an HR business partner to work is when somebody resigns and so there is a vacancy. Okay, because that is a moment where you can do organization design. That's organization design in action. That's where you ask the manager what exactly you need, what are the competencies you need, are we able to reframe the team, can we promote somebody, can we get somebody else. It's not just a dialogue with a recruiter that does only, John Doe left and I want to find a clone of John Doe. No, it's not just that. We need something more. And these are the moments in which HR can really make the difference. Now, is this impossible? No, but we need to teach HR and a lot, and I try to spend a lot of time also on this, to start thinking holistically again. We also got locked into a lot of silos where training is on one side, development is on another, organization design sometimes is sitting in a couple of people that keep their treasure protected tools. No, it needs to be a lot more diffused. And I think that the last 2 years, with the pandemic first, now also with the Ukraine war, etc., are showing that the duty of care that HR also has is not just about the psychology, it's not just about the well-being, which are very important, and they need to be there, but it's also about the well-being and the resilience of the organization. And sometimes a little bit against the idea that HR needs to take a leadership role, because it's not for us to take a leadership role, it's still a capability support. But I think that a lot of leaders are now understanding what this capability support can be.
Do you see over time this also maybe more evolving into a more formal education of managers? In org charts, that's like the half-life of like maybe a butterfly. Organizations are constantly in flux. And so that would strike me as this traditional model of analyze it for like 6 months, and then we design it for another 6 months, and then we roll it out for another 12 months or so, right? Those days must be gone, right? We must be much faster, much more agile. So that needs to happen at the front line, which means that we've really got to equip managers with somewhat a consistent framework for doing that work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, from my point of view, it's org design. It's a continuous improvement activity. It's not some, the idea that we do org design every 2 years, which is such a huge and painful activity within the organization, is also what made org design being feared within companies. In my consulting experience, I've been some time in companies where when a consultant was speaking with the org design expert of the organization, people were really scared. Okay, now something seriously wrong is going to happen. It shouldn't be like this, because it's like, it's almost like if you need to go to the dentist. Okay, when do you go? When is it too late, or you go and do a check every 6 months, etc., etc., etc. Now, I'm probably the worst example on this, because I would go the other side, because I'm also quite afraid of dentists. But jokes apart, the point is you need to maintain the organization constantly. And as you pointed out, you really need to focus on the fact that changes is happening so fast that every individual position needs to have a fine tune every now and then. That's why job crafting is so important, because you let the individual do part of the job, okay? And here comes one element that you focused very well. HR, one of the big errors that HR has been doing over the past, decades, has been the fact of hand-holding the manager on a lot of the process. HR designed this huge and tremendously complicated performance appraisal process so that we could then step in and help the manager do them, which for me it's a completely crazy idea, because the reality is that we need to create a simple process so that the manager doesn't need us, because that's not our added value. It's not our added value in that. Our added value is in having the discussion about how the team needs to be shaped for the future strategic needs. So is it education about the manager? Yes. We need also to explain them that org design is not about writing a 620 pages long racy matrix, but org design is thinking, what are the competences that I need for achieving the next year's strategy? How can I best develop these talents so that I retain the talent? How can I give more autonomy to these teams so that they can perform on their own and I don't need to micromanage them, etc. This is a maturity element more than just pure education in a traditional way. And probably it's what real leadership training is. And by leadership, I don't mean only for those at the higher level of the organization, but for everybody, because it's about really leading the organization. HR has another point element here, which is kind of becoming a guardian on keeping things simple within the organization, because in that case, then you enable managers to do their job.
Yeah, I think what strikes me as I'm listening to you, it's I mean, in its extreme, it probably goes into a direction like Hire has gone, right? In terms of creating a lot of like small businesses inside a larger organization, and then might create some mechanisms that allow these entities to function, which then puts the manager into an entrepreneurial role, right? And you end up with really flat organizations, and we know that in flat organizations, you don't actually need that much structure, right? Because the whole company is 20, 30 people, communication becomes easy and you become much more adaptable, right? Do you see that like as a trend picking up, that the companies think about like breaking themselves up into smaller, more entrepreneurial size entities?
The entire idea of self-management is a trend, definitely. And the idea of creating smaller enterprise entrepreneurial unit within a larger complex like the higher model is possibly one of the solutions. And I think that the trend is there for a simple reason. The acceleration that we have on the outside world imposes us that we shorten the time to take decision. And I'm talking of basic business decision. So the long chain of command doesn't work. How do we create an organization? This self-organization seems to be the answer. What I think, however, is that taking IR and copying it will not work. And again, we need to apply the concept of intentional organization, because we need to frame the consistency. We can get inspired, we can take a lot of them, okay? We can probably really adapt many of those works, but not create them completely. I mean, we saw them also with holacracy, sociocracy. We have had many different elements like this. And normally they have been working very well within one or two organizations, then a little bit like this with others. And the concept is there are a lot of things that we can learn from this organization. So it's also not about to discard that completely, because that's also the other risk. Oh, it doesn't apply to us. No, we can really learn a lot. And the higher model is a great example. But then it's a question of how we implement. And here comes the biggest difficulty very often is to enter into one area that many people don't consider as one point of discussion. Or design is also about discussing what work means for the people we bring in. Telling a manager, from tomorrow you're an entrepreneur, not a manager anymore, means altering what the concept of the work is. And this is not something that you can do outside of a value system and outside of an ecosystem that you need to build. So it's not, we need to avoid being too simplistic on certain elements and just copying things up like a stamp. On the other side, we also need to recognize that these elements are needed, because the traditional large-scale command and control chain does not work.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think every organization has to find its own path. Culture is different, the markets are different, the industry dynamics are different, right? I 100% agree. It's also a fantastic opportunity to create some management innovation, right? Because clearly what we have today doesn't work terribly well, right? So maybe we can build a better mousetrap here. And there's definitely room for more than one solution in the marketplace, right? Sergio, Thank you so much for taking the time. I really enjoyed the conversation. I loved some of your ideas, and I am a huge fan of your newsletter. So if folks are interested, check out the link and subscribe. It's a great read. I think it's very comprehensive, and I really appreciate you sharing your ideas and your thoughts with us today.
Thank you very much for the invite, and thank you all for listening. And again, if there are new ideas also for you, they're always welcome.
We hope you enjoyed this discussion. If you did, be sure to subscribe, like, share, or comment. Until next time, let's make work matter.